All right, so are you ready to dive deep with me today? Because we are talking all about lens adaptation.
Oh, I am always ready for lens talk.
Yeah, so specifically, we're looking at what happens when you take a Canon EF 85mm f1.4L IS lens and try to put it on a Fujifilm GFX camera system.
Interesting, yeah.
Right. It's kind of like fitting a square peg in a round hole, but, the results are interesting from what I've
I
seen.
can imagine, yeah.
So we're pulling from this article. It's called Adapting the Canon EF 85mm f1.4 LIS to Fujifilm GFX with the Metabones adapter.
Okay.
So get ready, buckle up. We're going to uncover the pros and the cons, the good, the bad, and the ugly
Awesome.
of this kind of Frankensteinian setup.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not just about like the specs and the numbers here,
Right.
We're talking about a lens that has a reputation, a certain character.
Yeah,
How does that translate when you put it on, a completely different system?
that's a good question.
That's what I think is going to make this so interesting.
Absolutely. And they jump right into it, too. I mean, right away, the article talks about initial impressions, like the look and the feel of this adapted lens on the GFX. And apparently, the author was impressed visually.
Okay.
The lens and the adapter have a very similar diameter.
Okay.
So it looks really nice on the camera.
Yeah, there's something to be said about that, right?
Yeah.
Like aesthetics, right?
Totally.
You want your gear to look good, feel good in the hands. But as we'll see, it's not all about just appearances.
Right, right. There's a catch.
Uh-oh.
They mentioned that while the initial visual impression was great, the weight, the combined weight of the lens and the adapter, after a couple hours of shooting, you really start to feel it.
Yeah, that's a reality check we often face in photography, right?
Yeah.
Balancing that functionality with the practicality.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, is the trade-off worth it?
Right. Okay, so let's get into some of the details. Autofocus.
Okay.
So initially, there was a speed issue, but simple restart and reattaching the lens seemed to fix that.
Oh, okay.
Just classic, turn it off and on again.
I was going to say the old trick, yeah.
But yeah, and once they did that, the single shot mode worked flawlessly.
Perfect. So it seems like it was just a little hiccup there.
Yeah, just a little firmware glitch or something.
Yeah.
Okay, next up, vignetting control. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The article highlights the excellent sensor coverage across various f-stops,
Okay.
which is pretty impressive for an adapted lens.
Right. We usually expect some compromises there, right?
Exactly.
So good to hear that it handles it well.
Yeah, and here's a little detail that I found interesting.
Okay.
Even at f1.4, where you do get vignetting, they say it's got a pleasing transition.
Ooh, that's nice.
So it's not just technically good, it's like potentially usable creatively.
Oh, totally.
I thought that was really interesting.
It's all about turning those limitations into, strengths.
Yeah.
If that vignetting has a pleasing quality to it, then it's a style choice as opposed to, some kind of technical flaw.
Right. Okay. Image quality.
Okay, let's get into it.
Let's talk image quality. So the author mentions recognizing those classic Canon L lens characteristics, rich colors, pleasing bokeh, that sharp but not overly clinical rendering.
Yeah.
It's
almost like it brings its own DNA to the GFX system in a way.
Yeah.
Like you're getting the little taste of that Canon look.
Yeah.
But on a larger, more detailed canvas.
Yeah, there is a caveat.
Oh, okay.
A little,
Right.
he mentions a little bit of smearing, just a little bit, in the corners at lower stops.
Gotcha.
He says it's really subtle and, you really have to pixel peep to see it.
Okay.
But it's worth mentioning.
Totally, yeah. This is where, understanding the technical aspect comes in handy.
Right.
We're talking about a full-frame lens on a larger sensor. There are bound to be some compromises at the edges.
Yeah.
The key is whether those compromises are acceptable for the type of photography you do.
Right. And this is, primarily a portrait lens, right?
Right.
So you're not necessarily looking for that tack sharp corner, especially when you're shooting wide open and you want that blurry background.
Exactly. It's about choosing the right tool for the job and knowing its strengths and limitations.
Okay. Now, let's give some credit where credit is due to the unsung hero here, the Fringer adapter.
The adapter.
Yes. The article talks about how it really provides a near native experience.
Okay.
Full autofocus functionality, face detection, subject tracking. It pretty much mirrors what you would get with a Fujinon lens.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Right.
The adapter is the bridge that makes this whole thing possible.
Yeah.
And if it can provide that kind of seamless experience, that's huge. because it opens up the possibility for people who want to adapt lenses.
Right, and get this. The author was incredibly impressed with the lens's resolution, even by 2024 standards,
Oh, wow.
at maximum aperture.
Okay.
It makes you think about how groundbreaking it must have been back in 2017 when it first came out.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
That speaks to, the quality of some of these lenses, their
Yeah.
ability to kind of stand the test of time.
Yeah.
Sometimes those older designs can still hold their own against, the latest and greatest.
Right, right. Okay, so let's address the elephant in the room, which is corner sharpness.
Oh, yeah.
And that, we talked about that smearing earlier.
Right.
So as expected, with a full frame lens on a larger sensor, you do get a bit of loss of resolution in the corners
Okay.
and a little bit more of that smearing at lower f-stops,
Okay.
specifically like f1.4 to f4.
Yeah. And this is where I think understanding those technical trade-offs is important. The lens was designed for a full-frame sensor, so stretching that image circle to cover the larger GFX sensor,
Right,
it's going to inevitably lead to some softness at the edges, especially at those wider apertures.
right. But here's the good news. Sharpness improves significantly by f5.6 and peaks at f8 and f11.
Okay, nice.
However, this is a portrait lens.
Yeah, exactly.
So that sweet spot of f1.4 with the beautiful bokeh, that might be more appealing to people even if the corners are a little softer.
It's all about priorities.
Yeah.
If you're a landscape photographer chasing ultimate sharpness across the frame, this might not be the ideal lens.
Right.
But for portraits, where your subject is often isolated against a blurry background, that corner sharpness might be less critical.
Exactly. Now, here's a cool little feature that might address this.
Okay.
The GFX has a 35mm crop mode,
Oh, right.
which basically crops the raw images to that standard 36 by 24mm format.
Okay.
So essentially mimicking a full-frame sensor.
Right.
And guess what? The EF 85mm f1.4L performs really well in this mode. Sharp corners from wide open, minimal purple fringing.
Ooh, that's a clever workaround.
Right.
It's like having the best of both worlds. You can use the full sensor when you need it, and then switch to crop mode when you want to maximize that sharpness and minimize those edge artifacts.
Right, and we can't forget about bokeh.
The bokeh.
The article describes it as gorgeous and smooth, with the occasional busyness depending on the background.
It's the soul of a portrait lens.
Yeah.
That creamy, dreamy background blur that makes your subject pop.
Right, and it sounds like this lens delivers.
Did it?
They do mention that there's minimal distortion, which could be due to the lens itself or some corrections being applied by the adapter, and a little bit of purple fringing in high contrast areas, but that's easily corrected in post.
Yeah, these are important details because they highlight the reality of lens performance, right? Like, no lens is perfect.
Right.
There are always compromises in these potential imperfections. But with modern software, we have more control than ever to kind of fine-tune those imperfections in post-processing.
Right. Okay, so let's be real about the size and weight here.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about it.
This lens is 950G.
Right.
Adapter is 116G. So total, you're looking at 1115G.
All right, so we're over 2 pounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty hefty.
Yeah, it is. And the length is 129mm.
Yeah, those numbers definitely put things into perspective,
Yeah.
It's one thing to say a lens is heavy, but then when you see the actual weight on paper, it's like, oh,
Right.
it becomes a more tangible consideration.
Yeah.
Especially when you compare that to the weight of some of those native GF lenses.
Right. And just to give folks some context, the adapted Canon is heavier than the Fujifilm GF 80mm f1.7.
Okay.
But it's basically the same weight and length as the GF 110mm f2.
Interesting.
So it's a trade-off there, Cost saving potentially, but maybe not as portable.
Right. And that's the decision that each photographer has to make for themselves. What are their priorities?
Right.
How much does portability factor into their shooting style?
Totally. And speaking of shooting style, the article talks about a very specific aspect of image quality that's really important for portrait photographers, which is bokeh.
Yes, the bokeh.
They describe the bokeh from this lens as gorgeous, smooth, with only occasional busyness depending on the background.
It's so important, right? Bokeh is that beautiful out-of-focus blur that can just elevate a portrait.
Yes.
And it sounds like, even adapted, this lens still retains that signature Canon look.
They say it does, and they also mention that there's minimal distortion, which could be due to the lens itself or the adapter applying some corrections,
Okay.
and a bit of purple fringing in high contrast areas, but again, easily corrected in post.
Right.
So just good to be aware of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's good to know these nuances. Like I said before, no lens is perfect.
Right.
But knowing what to expect and how to kind of address potential issues, that's key.
Yeah. I'm curious about build quality.
Okay.
So, I mean, is this lens going to fall apart after a few uses, especially if you buy a used one?
Well, according to the article, it sounds like this lens is built to last.
Oh, God.
They mentioned that even the secondhand model they were using showed no signs of any, age-related issues.
Oh, that's good.
Which is, it's reassuring, especially if you're thinking about buying used to save some money.
Absolutely. Okay.
That speaks to the durability of those Canon L series lenses.
Yeah.
They're designed for professional use. They got to be able to withstand some abuse.
Okay, let's circle back to that central question.
Okay.
Who is this lens for in the GFX universe?
Right, the big question.
The article lays out 4 kind of criteria for photographers who might find this adaptation appealing.
Okay. This is where it gets interesting. It's about understanding how this particular lens, with its unique, characteristics and its quirks,
Yeah.
how does it fit into different, photographic workflows?
Right, right. So first up, leveraging existing EF lenses. So if you are a photographer who already has a collection of Canon EF lenses, this adapter provides a way for you to use those lenses on the GFX system.
Right.
You don't have to buy a whole new set of, native GF lenses.
Yeah, it's a great way to transition to a new system
Yeah.
gradually, especially if you're not ready to part with your beloved, EF glass.
Right, right. Second, and this is huge for a lot of people, is cost saving over those native GF lenses.
Yes, real, yeah.
GF lenses are expensive, so
Right.
adapting an EF lens, especially if you can get a deal on a used one, can save you a lot of money.
It's all about, finding ways to maximize your budget, get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah.
And in this case, adapting a lens can be a smart way to do that.
Right, right. And then third, it's a little more nuanced. It's about seeking a vintage look, a little more character.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay.
The article suggests that this adapted lens might produce images with a slightly different aesthetic
Okay.
compared to the native GF lenses.
Oh.
A little bit more vintage, a little bit more film-like.
Yeah, that speaks to the artistic side of photography,
Right.
Sometimes it's not just about technical perfection. It's about finding, tools that help you achieve a certain, a certain feeling in your images.
Yeah, totally. And then finally, the fourth criteria is utilizing the lens's optical image stabilization with those older GFX bodies.
Ah, the IS.
So if you have a GFX camera that doesn't have in-body image stabilization, that IS in the Canon lens can be a real game changer, especially for handheld shooting.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's about, again, understanding the limitations of your gear
Yeah.
and finding ways to overcome them.
Yeah.
And in this case, adapting a lens with IS can expand your shooting capabilities.
So after hearing all of this, would you say adapting the Canon EF 85mm f1.4L IS to the GFX system is a good idea?
It's not a simple yes or no answer.
Right.
It really depends on the individual photographer,
Yeah.
their needs, their priorities, their shooting style.
But it sounds like there are some compelling reasons to consider it.
Absolutely. It's all about, weighing those pros and cons,
Right.
understanding those trade-offs, and then ultimately making an informed decision based on what's best for your specific situation.
Right, right. I am curious, though, about the smearing issue they mentioned.
Yeah.
How noticeable is that in actual images, and is it something you can easily fix?
So they described it as pretty subtle,
Okay.
mainly noticeable when you're pixel peeping.
Okay.
So unless you were constantly zoomed in to 100% on your images, it's probably not going to be a major distraction.
That's good to know. But what if you do notice it? Is there anything you can do?
There are some post-processing techniques that can help mitigate the smearing, but, the reality is that every lens has its limitations.
Right.
And, in this case, that slice softness in the corners, especially at those wider apertures, is one of the trade-offs you make for the other benefits of this adapted lens.
Right. So it's about finding the right balance, I guess, between image quality and practicality and just personal preference.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all solution in photography.
Right.
What works for one photographer might not work for another.
Right, right. So for our listeners out there who are considering adapting this lens, what would be your final piece of advice?
I would say, do your research.
Yeah.
weigh the pros and cons,
Uh-huh.
and most importantly, if you can, try before you buy.
Ah, good advice.
Rent the lens and adapter, see how it feels in your hands, test it out in real-world shooting scenarios.
Right.
That's the best way to determine if it's the right tool for you.
Good advice. Well, I think that's a great point to end part one on. So let's pick back up with a quick recap of what we've learned so far.
Sounds good to me.
So we're talking about adapting a Canon EF 85mm f1.4L IS lens to a Fujifilm GFX camera system.
Right. An interesting combo for sure.
Yeah, and we've seen that there's this kind of trade-off,
Right.
right? You get this potentially awesome image quality, this classic Canon look, but you're adding a lot of weight and bulk to the system.
Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act. You have to weigh those factors and see what's most important to you as a photographer.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to touch on a few things we mentioned in part one, just to kind of dig a little deeper
Okay.
and, maybe get some more insight from you.
Sure. Happy to share my thoughts.
So first off, autofocus. I know we said there was that initial speed issue, but it was easily fixed by restarting the camera and reattaching the lens.
Yeah, it's one of those classic tech glitches that we've all encountered at some point.
Totally. But once it was working, did the article mention anything about how snappy the autofocus was? Was it comparable to a native GF lens?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, the author did address that. They said that once the initial glitch was sorted out, the autofocus in single-shot mode was actually quite responsive.
Oh, interesting.
Not quite as fast as a native GF lens, perhaps,
Yeah.
but definitely usable. They were particularly impressed with the Fringer adapter's performance.
Right. Yeah, the adapter seems to be a key part of this whole setup working well.
Absolutely. It's the bridge between the two systems.
Right.
And if it's not up to par, the whole thing falls apart.
Totally. Okay, so let's talk about the image quality. The article raved about that classic Canon L lens look with rich colors, pleasing bokeh, and sharp but not overly clinical rendering.
That's what Canon lenses are known for, right? That sort of timeless, almost filmic quality.
Right. But then they mentioned the smearing in the corners at lower f-stops. How big of a deal is that really?
It's one of those things that you might not even notice unless you're really looking for it.
Yeah, okay.
The author said it was subtle and only noticeable when pixel peeping. So unless you're planning on printing your photos at billboard size, it's probably not going to be a deal breaker.
Right. And we did talk about how the GFX's 35mm crop mode might actually address that corner sharpness issue.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's a clever workaround. Basically, you're using a smaller portion of the sensor, which means you're not stretching the image circle of the lens as much.
Right, and as a result, you're getting sharper corners.
Exactly.
Pretty cool.
It's a nice option to have.
Okay, so we've got to talk about the weight again.
The elephant in the room, right?
Yeah, over 2 pounds for the lens and adapter combined. That's not insignificant.
No, it's not. But, it's all relative. I mean, if you're used to shooting with, a large format camera, 2 pounds might feel like a feather.
Uh-huh, that's true. It depends on your perspective, right?
Exactly. But seriously, if you're someone who values portability, this might not be the ideal setup. You have to consider how much that extra weight is going to impact your shooting experience.
Yeah, and how much time are you going to be spending carrying that thing around,
Right. It's all about trade-offs.
Totally. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about bokeh. The article was really enthusiastic about the bokeh from this lens, describing it as gorgeous and smooth.
Bokeh is so important, especially for portrait photography. It's that beautiful out-of-focus blur that can make your subject really stand out.
Yes, it's like magic.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this adapted Canon lens still delivers that beautiful bokeh that we've come to expect from Canon lenses.
Absolutely. And to me, that's a big part of what gives those images that classic Canon look.
Right, and it's something that you might not get with a native GF lens.
That's true. Every lens has its own unique character, and sometimes adapting a lens can bring something special to the table.
I like that.
Something different.
It's about expanding your options.
Exactly.
Okay, so last but not least, let's talk about durability. Is this lens built to last, or is it going to fall apart after a few uses, especially if you buy a used one?
Whoa. From what the article said, it sounds like this lens is a tank.
Oh, that's good.
They mentioned that even the secondhand model they were using showed no signs of age-related issues.
So it's like a reliable workhorse.
Exactly. Which is good to know, especially if you're considering buying used.
Totally. Okay, so now we're getting to the heart of the matter.
All right, let's get to it.
Who is this lens for?
The big question.
The million-dollar question, right? The article laid out 4 key criteria for photographers who might benefit from this adapted setup.
Okay, let's break those down.
All right, so the first one is leveraging existing EF lenses.
Right. If you already have a collection of Canon EF lenses, adapting them to the GFX system could be a smart move.
Yeah, especially if you're not quite ready to, like, fully commit to the GFX system and invest in all new GF lenses.
Totally. It's a way to ease into the system, get a feel for it, without having to start from scratch.
I like that.
A gradual transition.
Okay, so the second criteria, and this is a big one, is cost savings over native GF lenses.
Oh yeah, cost is a huge factor for a lot of photographers.
Huge, especially when you look at the price of GF lenses. Adapting an EF lens can be a significantly more affordable option, especially if you can find a good deal on a used one.
You know, it's all about making those dollars stretch as far as they can go. And in this case, adapting a lens can be a smart financial decision.
Definitely. And then the third criteria, this one's a little more stylistic.
Yeah.
Seeking a vintage look with more character.
Ooh, I like this one.
Yeah, the article mentioned that this adapted lens might produce images with a slightly different aesthetic than native GF lenses, something with a bit more of a vintage or filmic feel.
That's fascinating. It speaks to the idea that, sometimes imperfections can actually add to the beauty of an image.
Yeah.
That certain lenses can have a certain soul, a certain character that you just don't get with more modern, clinically perfect lenses.
That's so true. And sometimes it's those little imperfections that make an image really special.
Exactly. It's what gives it that unique look, that je ne sais quoi.
Okay. And then the last criteria is utilizing the lens's optical image stabilization with older GFX bodies.
Right. If you have a GFX camera that doesn't have in-body image stabilization,
Yeah.
the IS in the Canon lens can be a real lifesaver,
Huge.
especially if you like to shoot handheld.
Totally. So those are the 4 main criteria. It's interesting to think about how this one lens can appeal to such a diverse range of photographers.
Right, that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. It's not just about the technical aspects, it's about exploring the different ways that photographers can approach their craft, the different tools they can use to achieve their creative vision.
And that brings us to a very important question that we'll address in part 3. Would you, our listeners, consider adapting lenses? It's something to think about, right?
Absolutely.
The pros and the cons, the benefits, the trade-offs, all of that. We'll delve into that in just a moment, so stay tuned. All right, welcome back to part 3 of our deep dive. So, we've talked a lot about the technical aspects of adapting this Canon lens to the GFX system.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have, but I think there's another layer to this whole conversation.
Okay.
It's not just about the numbers, it's about the feel, the experience, the creative possibilities.
Yeah, I agree. It's about how the gear inspires you, how it helps you see the world differently.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes lens adaptations so intriguing. It's not just about using a different lens, it's about adopting a different mindset, a different approach to photography.
I like that. It's like stepping outside of your comfort zone, experimenting, breaking the rules a little bit.
Totally. And sometimes those experiments lead to amazing discoveries. You might find a new way of seeing, a new way of expressing yourself through your photography.
Absolutely. It's about pushing those boundaries, challenging those conventions. And sometimes those unconventional approaches yield the most rewarding results.
So thinking about this Canon lens on the GFX system, it's kind of like that, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of an unexpected pairing, a bit of a photographic fusion, if you will.
I like that, a photographic fusion. And it might not be for everyone, but for those photographers who are drawn to that classic Canon look, who value that kind of timeless filmic quality, this adaptation could be really special.
It's about finding the tools that resonate with your vision, that help you tell the stories you want to tell. And sometimes those tools might come from unexpected places.
Right, right. And it goes beyond just the look of the images, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's something to be said about the process, the experience of using a lens that's a bit different, a bit outside the norm.
It can be a very tactile, almost meditative experience.
Yeah.
You're more aware of the mechanics, the nuances of the lens.
Yes, you're slowing down, you're thinking more deliberately about each shot.
Right, and that can be really rewarding in its own right. It's like a rediscovery of the craft, a deeper appreciation for the art of photography.
And I think that's something that a lot of photographers are seeking these days, that kind of mindful, intentional approach to image making.
I agree. It's a way to connect more deeply with the moment, with the subject, and with yourself as an artist.
Totally. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to come back to that question we posed earlier. Would you, our listeners, consider adapting lenses?
It's a thought-provoking question for sure,
Right.
one that I hope our listeners will continue to ponder.
Yeah. And, it's not a simple yes or no answer.
Right. It's a very personal decision.
Yeah. There's so many factors to consider. Your budget, your shooting style, your creative vision, the gear you already own.
But ultimately, I think it comes down to this. Are you open to exploring new possibilities?
I love that.
Are you willing to step outside of your comfort zone and try something different?
Because sometimes those detours, those unexpected paths, can lead to the most amazing destinations.
Absolutely. That's where the magic happens, right? When we embrace the unknown, when we push ourselves to grow and evolve as photographers.
And on that note, we want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey of exploration. We hope you found it insightful, inspiring, and maybe even a little bit challenging.
It's been a pleasure sharing our thoughts and perspectives with you.
And we encourage you to keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep pushing the boundaries of your creativity.
Until next time, happy shooting.